Tell me if this has ever happened to you. You go to your local hardware store to buy a piece of wood. You spend time picking out the flattest, straightest, and best one you can find, only to bring it home and have it look like this. Well, you're not alone. And if you think that the quality of lumber has gone down, you're not wrong. Lumber today is much worse than it has ever been. And there's some very interesting reasons why. So in this video, we're going to explore that and answer the question as to why the quality of lumber is so terrible. And perhaps even more importantly, what you can do about it. If you think that the quality of lumber today is much lower than it's been before, you're right. In fact, I recently took this video at my local big box store, and you can see boards with all kinds of defects, including nasty knots, cups, bows, twists, wane, and even mold. And here are some pictures that I took on a job site recently showing the same kind of lumber in action. People sometimes have fun with it too, and there are even some hilarious memes floating out there talking about how terrible the lumber from Home Depot and Lowe's really is. But all joking aside, this is a real problem, and it didn't used to be like this. You used to be able to go to the hardware store and find some decent boards, but that just isn't the case anymore. In fact, you can see the change in quality by looking at pictures of the end grain on these old boards and these new boards. So what happened? Well, this declining quality has been going on for decades, and to really understand it, it helps to go all the way back to the beginning. When the first European settlers came to North America, they found that there wasn't much gold and silver like some of them had hoped, but there was another valuable resource, and that was trees. In fact, here is a map of the forested areas of North America just as the Pilgrims were arriving at Plymouth Rock. You can see vast, old-growth, virgin forests covering most of the land. At first, these trees were a nuisance, and the settlers burned them in order to clear land for farming. But before too long, the value of these forests as construction materials and for fuel became apparent. And European powers, who had logged most of their own forests and were in an arms race to see who could build the biggest navy, saw how useful these forests could be for shipbuilding. That need continued after the United States declared independence, and then the lumber industry exploded. Settlers traveled further and further into the frontier to manifest their destiny, and abundant sources of lumber were discovered nearly everywhere, especially in the Pacific Northwest and along the California coast, where massive redwoods and cedar trees were cut down. And the whole industry was facilitated by the railroads that allowed the lumber to be transported all across the country. These pictures from that time show how massive the lumber industry was and how massive these trees were. It's a real shame to see them cut down. Today, there are very few old-growth forests left in the US where you can find trees like giant sequoias, coast redwoods, and western red cedars. The need for lumber continued and really took off again after World War II, when there was a huge housing boom and a huge need for lumber. The lumber industry in Canada and in the Pacific Northwest of the United States took off like crazy. But things started to get tough in the 1980s and 90s because of this little guy right here. Now, before we talk about this guy, let's talk about this video's sponsor, NordVPN. The internet has made all of our lives much easier, but it's also created some unique challenges. There are bad actors out there who are constantly trying to get access to our systems and steal our data and ultimately our money. And it's important to protect yourself. That's where NordVPN comes in. NordVPN is a service that encrypts your data and allows you to browse the internet safely and securely, especially when you're on the road. NordVPN also offers other unique features that block websites that are fake, malicious, or used for scams. They even have a feature called Fake Shop Detection, which will warn you about fake shops that may pop up in your browser. I fell for one of these scams a few years ago, and luckily I realized it almost immediately and was able to get it taken care of through my credit card company, but only after hours on the phone. That wouldn't have been a problem had I had NordVPN at the time. Now, I'm pretty picky about the sponsors that I choose for my videos, but this one for me was a no-brainer because I already use NordVPN and I know that it works. So if this is something that you want to try, use my coupon code at nordvpn.com/DIY-with-Dave to get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan. And if you don't like it, they have a money-back guarantee. And so if you cancel within the first 30 days, you can get your money back. Now back to this guy. So as I mentioned, the lumber industry was just spinning along, but hit some significant problems in the 80s and 90s that a lot of people blame on this little creature. This is the spotted owl that's indigenous to the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. And in 1990, conservationists succeeded in declaring the spotted owl an endangered species. This meant that their habitat had to be protected, and that habitat was the areas that were being logged. That designation led to large areas being labeled as off-limits to logging. And then in the late 90s, the logging industry in the US collapsed. This had a devastating impact on people and towns all across the Pacific Northwest. Many of these towns were completely built around logging, and when the logging declined, local economies collapsed. People lost their jobs, and small cities and towns were emptied. There was a lot of anger at the time, and there were many protests. People were upset at how it was impacting the livelihood of logging families and logging communities.
And isn't the owl dying out part of evolution? We don't have no more dinosaurs.
But to blame all of that on the restrictions from the spotted owl is just too simplistic, because there was a lot going on in the late 90s. And one of the biggest things was globalization and changes in international trade. A lot of American and Canadian lumber at this time was sold to Asia, specifically to South Korea, China, and Japan. Each of these countries had cut down a large portion of their own native forests during World War II, and so they didn't have much of a domestic supply and relied heavily on North American lumber. Then two things happened. The first was that the US government placed restrictions on exports of lumber. This was done for a few different reasons. First was for price stability. It was thought that if too much lumber was sold overseas, then it would be too expensive for Americans to buy. The second was that lumber was considered a strategic resource, and restrictions were seen as a way to ensure that sufficient resources were available for domestic needs. Honestly, though, those countries were already on their way to buying much less US lumber anyway, in part because their own forests had had 50 years to recover since the war, and in part because international trade was becoming more feasible, and lumber from countries like Russia, Norway, Sweden, New Zealand, and Chile were now more readily available, and generally cheaper than US lumber. You can see that dramatic shift in the lumber exports to Japan, South Korea, and China at the time in these graphs. These abrupt changes in the market for lumber led to both supply and demand shocks, and as a result, mills crossed all over the Pacific Northwest. So that's a nice story and all, but what does all of this have to do with the quality of lumber that we see today? Well, a few things. First, the collapse of lumber markets led to a few developments. One of the major developments was consolidation. Smaller mills were either shuttered altogether or were bought up by much larger mills. This meant that there were fewer and fewer logging companies, and those that were left became large corporations. And what do corporations crave more than anything else? Growth and profits. And how do they usually get there? Through efficiency. So one of the developments that we have seen in mills today is that they've actually restricted the size of logs that they take. Logs that are considered too big are not taken because it would require them to change out tooling or modify their systems. And even though the lumber from those larger logs may be higher quality, those logs get rejected in the name of efficiency and are usually sent to the pulp mills rather than being used for boards. Next, these corporations started using sophisticated computer systems that tell them exactly how to cut each log to get the most out of it. In the past, that was done by more skilled human operators, but all of that is now done by computers. So pieces like this that would have been rejected as scrap in the past are now being cut and sold with what they consider to be minor defects. It's good for them because they get more lumber out of the same amount of logs, but it's bad for us because the quality of that lumber is much lower. The next thing to understand is how forestry and logging practices have changed over time. In the past, loggers were going out to natural forests or virgin forests, and when a tree grows in the wild, it has to combat wind and bad weather. There may be years of drought that can affect the wood, usually for the better. Naturally grown forests produce lumber that have a tighter grain, like the wood that I showed at the top of the video. I also have here a piece of western red cedar that was cut from a large naturally grown tree. If I put it up against this SPF 2x4 I recently bought from the hardware store, you can see the major differences. The growth rings on the new piece are massive compared with that old growth piece of wood. That's because it was essentially farmed. It was grown in straight rows for 20 or 30 years, where it didn't have to compete with other trees and received the optimal amount of sunlight, nutrients, and water to ensure that it grew quickly. And you can see that in the growth rings. Even in forests on federal land, like this land here in Oregon, you can see the practice of clear-cutting squares of land. These squares are reseeded and then trees are grown in ideal conditions for 20 to 30 years before being cut again. Again, that can actually be a good thing as we're not cutting down old growth forests, and trees ultimately are a renewable resource, but it is bad for the quality of the lumber that we get. There has also been an explosion of lumber plantations in the southern US, which has been fueled by farm subsidies like the Conservation Reserve Program or the CRP. In this program, farmers have been paid to convert their farmland into forest land, and now all of those forests are maturing and being cut. But again, many of those trees are of a certain size and were grown plantation style, and so the lumber is not as high quality as what we may have seen in the past. Another important factor is forest fire. When a fire sweeps through a forest, it can destroy millions of trees. In many cases, a lot of those trees can actually still be harvested and used for lumber, but that lumber tends to be of lower quality. The same is true for forests that are being damaged and decimated by pests like the mountain pine beetle. Again, these trees can still be harvested, but it has to happen quickly and the quality of the lumber tends to be much lower. So just to recap, old growth forests have been mostly cut down and the remaining old growth trees are protected. New forests are planted like plantations with ideal conditions and are harvested on regular schedules, leading to lower quality trees with fat growth rings. Consolidation in the lumber industry has led to a push for efficiency, and so larger logs, which may yield higher quality lumber, are usually sent to pulp mills because it would not be efficient for those logs to be made into boards because of how those mills are configured. Mills are also using more technology, which is leading to larger yields but lower quality. And lastly, dead logs from forest fires or beetle infestations are also being harvested regularly and are all of lower quality. So that was a lot, I know. But now you know why it's hard to find a decent board at the Home Depot. So now I'm actually really curious. What experiences have you had with terrible lumber? What is the worst board you've ever seen? Leave me a comment and let me know. Mine is probably this one. I actually pulled this off of a construction site scrap pile intentionally because of how messed up it is. It makes me laugh every time I see it, and I wanted to show it to you just so you could see how ridiculous this board is. All right, so now that we know all of the reasons why lumber is so terrible, we need to move on to the more important question, and that is, what can you do about it? Well, the first question you need to ask yourself is, do I really need higher quality boards? The lumber that is sold in most places is still tested and would be fine for most simple framing applications. So if that's all you need, it probably doesn't matter what you get. But if you need higher quality boards for something more specific where quality, strength, or aesthetics are important, then there are some things you can do. The first is to be picky with your boards. Now, I don't want you to be the guy who spends 3 hours picking through every last board on a pallet. And so there is a quick way to find the best boards, and that is by looking at the end grain. Here are the things that you want to look for. The first thing that you want to avoid is something called the pith. The pith is the very center of the tree, and it tends to dry out and split, which will cause the lumber to crack or twist. So avoid any board with a pith. Second are boards with thick growth rings. We already talked about this a bit, so I don't need to say much more about it, but the key thing to remember with growth rings is the tighter the better.
That's what she said.
Next, you want boards that are either flat sawn with nearly flat rings or rift sawn. Flat sawn boards have horizontal growth rings and rift sawn boards have vertical growth rings. A flat sawn board that is too dramatic like this will tend to cup around that shape. The flatter those lines are, the less likely the board is to do this. Rift sawn boards are inherently more stable because there isn't the same pressures on the wood to warp or bend as there are with other cuts of wood. Once you've selected for the end grain, look down the length of the boards. Avoid boards that have too many knots or other defects or are bowed or have other issues. After some time in practice, you're going to get really good at this and you'll be able to quickly pick out the best boards. The other way to get better quality boards is by not buying your lumber at a big box store like Lowe's or Home Depot. These stores try really hard to compete on price, and lower quality lumber is cheaper, and so that's often what you'll find there. Lumber has grades that are given based upon a number of factors, including the grain pattern, defects, and other things, and buying higher grade lumber will give you better boards. Most of the lumber you find at a big box store are number 2 or lower. So if you want higher quality lumber, you'll probably need to go to an actual lumber yard. Another thing that you can do is to buy larger boards or wider boards and then cut them down to the size you need. This will be a little bit more expensive, but not enough to break the bank, and you'll get much better boards. The only caveat here is that sometimes cutting a board will release internal tensions within the wood that could cause it to warp, so watch out for that. So there you have it. Lumber quality is terrible, and there are some very specific reasons why, but understanding that will actually help you pick out the best boards for your next project. Now, I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, be sure to share it with someone else who will also find it interesting. And then be sure to check out some of my other videos as well. Be sure also to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next one.